Esther and Rebecca, and today we're presenting on the U.S. Export-Import Bank, should it burn? So, the Export-Import Bank, or EXIM for short, is the subject of a lot of debate in Washington, and if you guys remember a few sessions back, we watched Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders kind of battle it out, debating whether the EXIM Bank was fundamentally bad or fundamentally good. So today we're going to try to present a more nuanced debate by scratching beneath the surface. And when we went on the website, the EXIM Bank really kind of sold itself as a win-win situation, as a benefit for the taxpayers, for the private manufacturers, and for the private banks. But is that really the case? So the EXIM Bank actually accounts for less than 2% of U.S. exports, and also 61% of its financing goes to just 10 companies. So these are large corporations such as General Electric and Boeing. And today our presentation will focus on and present some of the arguments for and against and the pros and cons of EXIM, along with some case studies. So our outline is as follows. We're going to split our presentation into two parts. First, we're going to present the EXIM Bank as an asset to the trade, the economy, the players. And we're going to talk about how the individual players win, how the U.S. economy wins, and we're going to give you guys a case study. In the second part, we're going to talk about how it actually interferes negatively in the market. We're going to talk about how individual players lose, how the economy loses, and present you guys with a case study. But firstly, I'm going to briefly summarize the main functions of the EXIM Bank. So it's an independent agency of the federal government, and there are three main ways it provides subsidies. So first, it sells insurance to foreign purchasers of domestic goods. Second, it directly loans to American firms to boost their export. And thirdly, it guarantees loans that private banks like Goldman Sachs make to foreign buyers of American goods. So most of EXIM's assistance comes in the form of the third. These are loan guarantees to foreign purchasers. And I'm just going to elaborate a little bit on how this form actually operates. So let's just say a foreign airline, Air Emil, wants to buy from an American manufacturer. Perfect. So Emil pays a fee to EXIM, Esther, and in exchange, Esther guarantees up to 85% of the loan that the private bank makes to Emil. So in other words, Esther agrees to assume a large percentage of the risk that I loan to Emil, basically. And if Emil can't pay me back, then EXIM Esther offers to cover the cost, so she'll pay me. Because Esther agrees or guarantees the repayment of a large percentage of the loan, Emil can get a better deal, obtain financing on better conditions from me or a private bank. And so then it could on the private market, for example. So foreign firms buy more American-made products and the U.S. sell more exports.
So now for the first part, we'll go through all of the different ways, like the arguments for the EXIM Bank as a positive, as good for. I'll talk about first individual players in this market. So as Rebecca has just explained, specifically the foreign loan guarantees, which is the main mechanism by which the EXIM provides funding. They have a very, very direct benefits for each of the individual players involved. I'll go through all of them. So first off, there's American companies and producers. So large and small businesses can support their export-oriented business by securing the support of the EXIM Bank. So specifically for large manufacturing companies, like we'll use the example of Boeing, whose products are both very expensive and whose products also generally come in large orders. Many of their customers can't actually afford to pay up front, so they require getting a loan from a bank in order to pay them. But a lot of these customers are actually subprime, and they cannot secure a loan on the private market very easily. So, for example, Boeing says that if the EXIM back last year when the EXIM Bank was closed down for partisan reasons, Boeing is actually threatening that if the EXIM Bank did not open back up, they would have to move their operations to Canada, because in Canada they have an EXIM Bank that will be able to support their exports. And also their main competitor in France, Airbus, has multiple EXIM Banks backing their exports. So, also private American banks who give out these loans win because they can feel comfortable extending the loan to foreign purchasers of American products because they know that in the event of the foreign purchaser defaulting on that loan, they will still receive payment from the EXIM Bank. And they still are making money all along off the interest payments, obviously, the same loans. So foreign companies also obviously win because they have better access to American goods that they want to buy, and they can buy them and secure loans for them with much more agreeable terms than they would on the private market, thanks to the support of the EXIM Bank. And also getting into a little bit more of the partisan or of the political aspect of it, the Exim Bank is beneficial to all of those in government who are proponents of the Exim Bank because they get to take credit for increased exports and the benefits that it serves to the American economy. And it kind of explains why perhaps a politician might be amenable to the idea of renewing the Exim Bank when the time to renew its mandate comes around.
So considering the U.S. economy as a whole, it's maybe obvious that it has positive effects, but nonetheless important. And it's not surprising that this economic activity and there's these actors participating in the U.S. economy, like Griffin was just talking about, produces a positive effect since you have these trade deals, right, that increase exports, boost overall production, GDP, spurs investment, and economic growth for the small and large businesses. And then it also sustains and creates jobs, which could otherwise be lost to Russia or China, for example. So we see basically that the presence of the U.S. Exim helps keep the U.S. economy competitive with the rest of the world. And so, of course, these are points that the U.S. Exim Bank likes to emphasize. First of all, it has maintained a default rate of less than 1% since its creation in 1934. So in this way, it isn't really a risky thing for the government to run. It claims it has backed $27.5 million in exports in fiscal 2014 and supported 164,000 American jobs. And since 2009, that number has apparently totaled to 1.2 million jobs. So obviously, not next to zero. And additionally, Exim notes that it has made money for the government, sending more than $674 million in profits to the U.S. Treasury in fiscal 2014. So we can see that overall it has had positive effects in the U.S. economy.
Okay, so now the Exim Bank has been presented sort of as a win-win situation, and here you have a case of a company which certainly has benefited from Exim support. This is Applied Machinery Corporation, which is a small, medium-sized business based in Houston, Texas. They have about 500 employees. And what they do is they sell these land-based drilling rigs for oil. And they sell these rigs to overseas customers in places such as Argentina, Nigeria, Colombia, the Philippines, and Saudi Arabia, just to name a few. And when the Exim Bank was shut down from July to December last year, this was one of the small companies that publicly expressed discontent with this shutdown because they said without Exim support, this, I'm just going to call them AMC, would lose or could shrink about 50%, which naturally for a small company like this translated into a few hundred jobs. But what this said was even more important in terms of the U.S. economy as a whole is the fact that more people would actually be laid off because this company buys tons of steel, mainly from American steel companies. But they also buy other parts for these custom-made oil rigs. So in other words, it would be a chain effect that would ripple through the manufacturing industry and potentially lose contracts in other companies. So in practical terms, the operation of transporting this equipment for their production touches hundreds of others who support ports and shipping companies, and also the countless others who in what is the biggest exporting industry in the United States. So now a question could be, could they potentially compete internationally without this Exim support? And here, the fact is that AMC oil rigs cost between $14 to $30 million a piece, and so naturally customers, they would need some kind of financing in order to pay for it, in most cases at least. And they estimate that generally American oil rigs and their custom-made oil rigs are of a better quality and more expensive than, say, for instance, Chinese ones. So the reality is that the U.S. would not be able to compete with the financing terms offered by countries such as China, and so without the Exim support, the Chinese firms would win. So in sum, to translate this into how the individual players in this specific case wins, well, first of all, it's naturally good for AMC because the funding allows them to sell their products overseas, and this gives them a profit. But it's also good for the commercial bank, which lends the money to the overseas buyer of these oil rigs, because this commercial bank gets to make these profitable loans without risk because they offload the risk to the Exim Bank. And ultimately, this circle will lead to more manufacturing jobs and created for AMC and its supply chain.
So now we're going to take a transition from the first part of our presentation, which talked about kind of the benefits and how there are players that win, to now the second part of our presentation, which is how it actually is a con and how it negatively affects the market. So while Griffin, Emil, and Esther has talked about players that win and the economy that win, there are losers. So first of all, anyone other than the privileged buyers that try to buy an airplane or an oil rig loses. So imagine if Emil and I were trying to buy the same product, but Emil's bid is subsidized by the taxpayers. Clearly, I would have to end up paying more in order to sustain the same amount of competition. So all airlines or oil rigs, their employees, and hundreds of millions of passengers who fly on airlines or is related to the oil industry, other than Emil Air, will lose. So this is also in parallel to what Emil has talked about with the chain effect and the domino market. So if one market is affected, this kind of trickles down and has a domino effect on subsequent markets, and in the end will affect all consumers and individual players like individuals. International players like individuals. So actually, Esther's subsidies artificially raise the price of airplanes. That ends up artificially raising the price of air travel. So not only foreign airlines, but all international travelers and any industry related to airlines will lose and will be subsequently affected. So international carriers are also harmed by losing market share to Air Emil. And this explains why some of the airlines have sued to stop XM subsidies, which is a case study that Esther will elaborate on later. And the second player that loses are U.S. taxpayers. Since U.S. taxpayers are technically funding the XM Bank and therefore offsetting the risk that XM engages in, which is something that the XM likes to ignore out of its predictions and reports, XM actually takes out more than it puts in. And as Emil will elaborate on now, taxpayers are also a loser or will not benefit from XM.
Yeah, so the traditional argument for the XM Bank is that the XM Bank returns more to the treasury than it takes out. But in reality, numbers show that they have actually been operating at a loss for over a decade. The XM Bank has even been put under investigation by different agencies such as the Federal Government Accountability Office, the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, as well as the agency's own Inspector General, for their risk to taxpayers. And the CBO actually estimates that when you account for those risks, the XM Bank adds about $2 billion to the deficit over the next decade. So that's pretty significant as well. And then if you translate this into a sort of general economic argument, one can doubt whether the state can indeed improve the overall welfare over the long run by subsidizing exports, because internal economic policies are ultimately the mechanisms that determine the overall level of the state's exports. So when you provide financing or insurance for exporters, the XM Bank's activities draw from financial resources that within the economy that would be available for other uses potentially. So this is, we can call this a potential opportunity cost. And then another important question to raise, which is what also Bernie Sanders raises, is do these companies like Boeing and Caterpillar actually need the funding? Would they, because they're so big and they're so big players on the market? Because it also helps foreign companies compete with the American ones by buying these American-made products. So you can also say that Sanders' arguments aren't completely insignificant.
So to illustrate this subsidy criticism that Rebecca was mentioning earlier, I have this case of Delta Airlines versus the XM Bank of the United States, which was ruled on in the DC Federal Court on April 6, 2015, so it's pretty recent. And in this case, Delta sues the US XM Bank, claiming that it is helping international competitors at the airline's expense, so they're renewing a legal fight over subsidies that benefit aircraft exporters such as Boeing, and by extension non-US airlines. In other words, Delta is against the loan guarantees that are given to support purchases of Boeing's wide-body planes by certain foreign airlines. This is problematic, right, for Delta because, as they claim, airline rivals like Air India and Emirates have used XM guarantees to lower their borrowing costs, then use the savings to cut ticket prices on international routes that compete with Delta or buy still more jets. So Delta has also argued that unsubsidized U.S. airlines will be forced to respond by reducing their prices and reducing or altogether eliminating their capacity to serve those routes where they compete with bank-subsidized foreign airlines. So we can see how these subsidies put economic pressures on Delta and similar airlines, even if they are, benefiting U.S. companies such as Boeing. There are other American companies paying kind of the price, and this is why they would like to see the Exim closed. The court, however, ruled in favor of the Exim Bank, the judge calling Delta's arguments unpersuasive. What is interesting about this case is that we see that it isn't so much a deal or so much about a legal or economic battle, but rather a political one. As you see, failing through legal means, like Delta just did, their only hope of seeing an end to the Exim Bank is if Congress votes to end it, basically making this an entirely political matter. And we can see this also by the fact that Delta has spent apparently like $10 million in lobbying on the Hill against this bank. And so we have the current situation now where the bank did get reauthorized in October 2016 anyway, despite this case. And now it has a mandate that is set to expire September 2019. So right now maybe the debate has calmed a little bit, but it's certain to resurface once the expiration date approaches again.
So just to conclude a little bit, we have should it burn? Having it examine like the cost and benefits to the U.S. economy as a whole, we'd say probably, but will it? Probably not. And maybe we can shed some light on that. So given our analysis, it's clear that both sides of the argument, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders in these hypotheticals, they both lack a degree of nuance in discussing the pros and cons of the exit. So proponents of the bank frame it as an essential job creator, an export booster, while opponents say that these exports are artificially boosted and that they inflate prices for those who do not benefit from exit support. Supporters say that the bank doesn't cost taxpayers a dime because it simply provides loan security for private lenders. But those loans necessarily involve risk, which therefore costs taxpayers money. And perhaps the argument goes that taxpayers shouldn't be exposed to this kind of risk when they're by an institution that they don't have direct control over. To get back to the debate a little bit in March, what Hillary Clinton was saying, here we have a quote: if we're going to compete in the global economy, we can't let every other country support their companies, and we take a hands-off approach, as in we can't get rid of our Exim Bank because we wouldn't be supporting our own companies and our own economy. However, this is framing the whole Exim Bank argument in the kind of we need to have it because everybody else has it kind of way. And if we don't have it, then everybody else is going to crucify us in foreign trade. But it's interesting to know that the U.S. was actually the first country to establish an Exim Bank 80 years ago, and only then did every other country, all the countries that have it, follow suit afterwards. And in speaking about the U.S. Exim Bank, most officials, for example, an official from the Exim Bank of Japan was quoted as saying Nexi, which is the name of one of those, is more collaborator with U.S. Exim rather than a competitor. The U.S. Exim is more of a partner of Exim, which is Export Investment Service. Also, in April 2014, the U.S. Exim Bank extended a U.S. taxpayer finance loan to the Exim Bank of China, and it was for $18.4 billion. So this goes to show that while perhaps individual American companies need to compete with foreign ones, and the Exim plays a role there, that doesn't mean that the Exim Bank itself is needing to compete with other Exim Banks. The Exim Bank plays a bigger, important role in the larger global economy as a tool for cooperation amongst trading partners like the U.S. and China.
Do you think that they need ethical community like to be in a mutual fund?
The what?
Yes. Do you think that they need like an ethical community like the
Ethical committee. Do they need an ethical committee? I don't think that would work very well in the U.S.
No, I don't think it's so much about ethics. It's about which business interests you're trying to represent, and how essential it is, and whether the company that's getting the export support could still be doing business without it.
There's also a huge issue of transparency and corruption based on the Solyndra case that we didn't have time to mention. But yeah, so I don't think that the U.S. is necessarily kind of accountable to people.
It's not gonna, it's not living, it's not staying. How do you think we could make it more relevant or try and improve and make this possible?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
It's not going anywhere. Like, how
will, like, I don't know, be more relevant.
Okay, so that goes back to you're saying like the renewable energy, right? Exporting U.S. technology.
Yeah, like we didn't really want to. We didn't this semester to talk about it, but like we were thinking about like in the future, like looking forward to like the green economy, things like that. If the U.S. is planning to be, like a global leader in environmental sustainability and stuff like that, then the Exim Bank seems like something that could be very much a tool to support that kind of, exporting that kind of technology abroad. So there's a lot of places that the Exim Bank could go, and for example, Boeing is the only company that the U.S. really has that is food in aerospace. So if we didn't have the Exim and Boeing deciding to Canada, what would we do? So that's why it's a nuanced issue. It's very important in some aspects, but there's a lot of inefficiencies in the system that there are everywhere else.
My question is just, does Boeing have to carry Airbus in the future?
Say what?
Does Boeing have to carry Airbus in the future? Or
If they have to.
Fear.
Airbus is always.
Yeah, I mean,
Always.
it's basically the opposite. I'd say, yeah. I mean,
They're always at the
and there's a lot of examples of this.
Never be complacent.
Ethiopia Airlines wanted to get a loan from the U.S. Exim Bank, and they couldn't because it's closed. And then they were like, well, we're going to try to Airbus. So it happens very quickly.
As far as competitors are concerned, do you think that U.S. businesses are rewarded by other export banks or by foreign businesses that can benefit from U.S. exports?
Well, that's kind of like the conclusion. I was mentioning that very briefly. U.S. Exim Bank actually works a lot with other Exim banks in order to promote whether it's a project or a company or a particular industry that's beneficial to both of the countries. I can't think of an example right now. But it's mainly like U.S. businesses competing with foreign businesses, and not really the Exim banks themselves.
Yeah.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
Isn't it a prisoner's dilemma for exit banks?
A prisoner's dilemma? Oh, okay. I don't think it's like a zero-sum game for Exim banks. Like, they're not often pitched as competitors as we're often kind of led to believe. I think a lot of them work in conjunction, actually work in cooperation with each other. So, especially with the case with the US Exim and the Chinese Exim, like, they actually have a lot of projects in cooperation with each other. And I think that because the causal chain is so complex, we cannot say that because one Exim wins, the other will lose necessarily. So, I don't think that it is a prisoner's dilemma, and I don't think it's a zero-sum game.
Right. Okay.